Welcome to the first of two plenary lectures for the 8th annual Generative Anthropology Summer Conference. My name is Richard Van Oort. I am a member of the English department at UVic. The English department is sponsoring this lecture. Eric Gans comes to us as our Lansdowne visitor, and we're very pleased to have him here. And I'd just like to begin by thanking my colleagues in the English department for supporting his application for the Lansdowne, or my application to bring Eric to our campus, to Victoria. I'm very grateful for your support. Let me just say a few words of introduction about Eric. Eric comes from the University of California at Los Angeles. He's professor of French and has been at UCLA since 1969, I believe. Yes. He has a BA from Columbia, which he got in 1960, and a PhD from Johns Hopkins, which he got in 1966. And at Johns Hopkins, he met and studied with René Girard. And as I learned today, he was actually Girard's very first student. And Girard's influence was quite important early on for Gans, and we'll see some of that probably in this talk today. Gans has published many books in both French and English on all kinds of topics in a wide range of fields, including literary studies, film studies, religious studies, and cultural studies. But he's best known for his theory of generative anthropology, which is what he will be talking about today. This theory assumes what is pretty much taboo today, namely the idea that human beings are unique among animals because of their capacity for symbolic representation. Gans eschews the popular biological reductionism of many scientists, as well as the equally popular false humility of many humanists who argued that there's nothing unique about humans, and that, moreover, the idea that humans are unique is responsible for all manner of ethical disasters. In other words, Eric is a rarity in today's academic world. Despite the enormous and often insidious pressure exerted on us to stay within our tightly bounded academic boundaries, our fields and specialties, Gans has quite stubbornly refused to play by the rules, I'm happy to say. Not only has he ranged widely beyond his specialty of 19th century French literature, he wrote his dissertation on Flaubert, he has developed an entire theory to explain why we are obliged to think the underlying unity of our species. This theory, which he calls generative anthropology, challenges us to think in critical and minimal fashion about the fundamental anthropological categories that enable us to define the human at all. In a sense, such a theory is anathema to scholarship in the university because the university succeeds by hiving off as many separate and independent entities as possible. Disciplines and specialties are at peace with one another when you stay off one another's turf. This intellectual problem is analogous to a more general ethical problem, namely the problem of cultural differences, or in other words, the problem of relativism. Ethically speaking, our cultural differences are to be respected and applauded. No one doubts that. But why then argue that these differences are meaningful only because they stem from an underlying anthropological unity? This is a move that very few are willing to make today, but it's a move that Gans makes. And he makes it, I might add, with unabashed intellectual chutzpah. Of course, from a purely sociological point of view, too much chutzpah can be a problem. If you stick your neck out, someone eventually will chop it off. I'm a Shakespearean, as some of you know very well, and so I'm inclined to compare people with Shakespearean characters. Eric reminds me of Shakespeare's last tragic hero, Coriolanus. Eric doesn't know this, but Coriolanus actually was the first Bronx romantic. Here I have to digress just a tiny bit and tell a very brief anecdote. Gans went to Columbia at the age of 16, and his original idea was to study mathematics. But after a year in the math program, he realized that there were just 1 or 2 math geniuses in his cohort, and that though he was very good at math, he probably wasn't going to be the math savant that they were. So he switched to French, despite not speaking a word of the language. And 2 years later, he was a fluent speaker and reader of French. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you here is that Gans has plenty of chutzpah. And this has stood him in good stead in the long and sometimes lonely road he has taken in arguing for the necessity in the humanities for a general theory of the human. In 1981, he published his first book of Generative Anthropology, The Origin of Language. Since then, he has published 8 books developing the hypothesis that human language and culture originated excuse me, in a unique and collectively memorable event. In his lecture today, Professor Gans will be talking about some of the affinities as well as some of the differences between generative anthropology and Derrida's notion of grammatology. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eric Gans.
Well, thank you very much. You know, I've always managed so far, and I think I will manage forever, to avoid a certain type of celebrity where people are kind of treating you as someone important. And I hope that this continues. So there's a sort of, it's somewhat humbling. That sounds self-serving, but there's something humbling about, you know, people who show an interest in what you're doing because it makes you feel. So I will try to avoid that. But this conference in particular has been very, I should say, heartwarming for me. It's being run by Richard, who I met quite a few years ago. At the time, I think 1994, the year before I founded Anthropoetics, which was based on an MLA session where Richard and a couple of other stalwarts, including Matt Schneider, were present. Matt Schneider, are you here somewhere?
Here, yeah.
Oh, okay. And so, you know, that's already one kind of historic moment. And then I won't embarrass any individuals, but one of my oldest students who I hadn't seen much of in the past couple of decades, and who was really the one who told me, you know, you should give a seminar on generative anthropology. This was back in the mid-'80s. And so he was really the person that stimulated me to give my first seminars at UCLA, which began in 1987. And he is here, and he gave an excellent paper this afternoon. And I don't know if I should, you know, I won't embarrass anybody, but it's kind of a heartwarming moment. Well, I thought, you know, I was going to give this paper on Derrida, but I thought I would instead give another paper which I've written on Beckett's on Waiting for Godot. And this is a little in-joke because we've had a couple of papers on Waiting for Godot this afternoon. No, I won't. But this paper is something of a repetition. Last November, I gave a paper in France. They have this Girardian organization called Société Mimique.
Association Recherche.
Oh, I should know this because my friend McKenna here is a specialist in this field. Well, Andrew was actually the MC at this. Yes, Association Recherche Mimétique, or ARM. But in any case, so I gave it, they were having a colloquium on Girard and Derrida, so I gave this talk, more or less, in French, of course, and when I learned that the topic this time would be essentially deconstruction, or GA and deconstruction, well, you know, it seemed like an appropriate topic that didn't require too much change. I did add a few things, and just translating it from French to English makes a big difference. You'd be surprised how Gallic it sounded when I translated. So I don't think there's too much Gallic left. It isn't something, you know, this isn't terribly new, but I think it's fundamental, and I think it's important, especially since there are a number of people in the old days, the problem was that you had people who kind of adored Derrida, you know, and they said, well, Girard, it's too easy. We understand what he's saying, you know. Derrida, well, you know. That era is sort of over, and today I hear more often, oh, Derrida is a farceur, you know. Well, I don't think so. I think that there are some good people in that generation, you know, Lacan, but Derrida, I think, is an important thinker, especially in his early work, when there's a certain, I hate to say sincerity, but there's a certain desire to really say something as opposed to playing games with words. And I think in the early work, he came up at least with one very significant concept, which of course is linked to his other concepts, and that's the concept of deferral, or la différence, which in French he spells with an A to emphasize its verbal quality, because, you know, différence is like a difference, but différence, the A-N-C-E, is his way of saying it's differing. It's not, you know, it's not just difference as a noun, it's a kind of a verbal, a gerundive. But in any case, so he invented this word, you know, différence, which he writes with an A. So I think that's a very significant concept. You can forget about the wordplay, but the question and the fact that it's a difference that you can't hear, because in French we pronounce it the same way. You know, A-N-C-E, E-N-C is the same. But I think it's a very significant concept, and I saw many years ago when I wrote an essay called Differences, which came out in the 90s, I guess.
81.
No, did that essay come out? Is that early? Yeah, well, it was an early essay. In any case, I wrote this, I remember in Paris, I can still remember sitting in some cafe writing it. But in any case, that essay where I came up with the sort of basic slogan for GA, which is that it's that language is where did it go? The deferral of conflict through the deferral of mimetic conflict through representation. So that the deferral is the Derridian idea, the mimetic conflict, of course, is the Girardian idea, and so the deferral of conflict through representation is kind of a simple way of talking about generative anthropology. Okay, let me then read my paper, and we will be able to talk about it afterwards, and we'll have Dr. Cobley will give I wouldn't say rebuttal, but a response. Although the memory of Jacques Derrida is still very much with us, I wonder to what extent young people today can imagine the impact of De la Grammatologie when it appeared in 1967, nearly a half-century ago. In contrast to Derrida's doctoral thesis on Husserl, La Voix et le Phénomène, and the articles that made up the collection L'écriture et la différence, all published the same year, De la Grammatologie, which proclaimed the end of the book, this is a quote, the end of the book and the beginning of writing, la fin du livre et le commencement de l'écriture, was neither a collection of essays nor a monograph, but a book, a whole composed of parts, no doubt, of chapters on linguistics, on Lévi-Strauss, on Rousseau, but nevertheless a book, that is, in the author's own paradoxical terms, a work of authority, that presented itself as the opening exposition of a new science of writing, in the broadest sense, a science of the trace, as he called it. A Derridian science would certainly be a science like no other, but we need not, as was so common in the perverse heyday of deconstruction, turn the limits of the positive into a demonstration of the negative. In the same way as we are able to convert Derrida's différence or deferral, the void of paradigmatic choice in which Derrida never thought to seek the trace of a deferred act in the real world, into the deferral of violence. That is, the Derrida's notion of deferral, which remains within a paradigm, but he never thought to convert it into a deferred act in the real world. This into the deferral of violence, that is, induced by the sacred and mimetic violence, into the deferral of violence induced by the sacred and mimetic violence à la René Girard, I think that we can equally well understand the projected science of grammatology as something other than a paradoxical denial of the empirical reality of language. Indeed, I think that we can conceive it as an intuition of human science in the strongest sense, a science of paradox rather than itself a paradox, something that would correspond rather closely to our own anthropological science of generative anthropology. That is, that sentence might have been a bit complex, but I'm just saying that we can sort of think about GA and grammatology as ways of dealing with the same thing, as in a way GA being the fulfillment of the notion of grammatology. What is the real thrust? What is the real thrust of Derrida's science of écriture or of inscription? It is to understand the phenomenon of the human, and perhaps by extension, all of life or all of existence, which is something that I think people don't always notice in there, from the standpoint of the conservation of the trace. The trace being the inscription or the writing, basically. That is, grammatology would be the study of the sign, conceived as the trace of an act that remarks a difference or remarks a difference by means of a deferral or différence, a hesitation that is not merely a delay, but that opens up a Sartrean néant or nothingness in which the human mind, no longer ruled by instincts, becomes able to think by choosing in the first instance a single non-instinctual and indefinitely reproducible sign that bears the significance of the sacred object, but not its interdicted sacrality. The original paradigm was simply the binary sacred-profane, that is the Durkheimian binary, right? And there was no need of a sign for the latter, that is the profane. You only needed a sign for the thing that was important, the sacred. The profane is everything else. And but once the néant out there on the public scene transformed potential violent conflict into the peaceful sharing of food, which is how the originary hypothesis presents the scenario, the trace of the sign preserved in the mind was not a mere individual memory, a recalled sense impression, but a mental reconstruction of the scene of representation as a whole, a space within which thinking as the free manipulation of signs became possible. Thinking in the human, non-instinctive sense requires that the thinker be assured of the connection, sacred and or social, between the sign and what it represents. To ask where this connection originates is to pose a question that cannot be answered within the context of deconstruction, nor, by the way, within the context of Darwinism, which can only theorize the hesitation that separates the signifier from the signified within an already constituted paradigm. Perhaps I should make clear that, Derrida's idea of différence is that if, for instance, I say that that is purple, well, when I say purple, I can't just say it's immediately purple because I have to think there's a paradigm. It could be purple, red, green, yellow, blue. And so by choosing purple, I'm choosing from a paradigm, and therefore I'm making a difference. I'm choosing that difference and therefore not making some kind of immediate statement about its purpleness. And it's that non-immediacy which Derrida calls la différence. But my point is that whether or not you have 1 or 25 colors, it's the use of the linguistic term, it's the use of language, which is the hesitation that makes you use, that creates the différence, that separates you, in other words, from the immediacy of the world. And that in the originary scene, you have the idea of grasping for an object of desire and then realizing that if others are also grasping for it, you might get into some kind of conflict. And so the so-called abortive gesture of appropriation is the origin of the sign. And once it becomes an abortive gesture of appropriation, then you don't need a paradigm. It's enough to say this is sacred. That gesture itself embodies deferral. It's deferral of appropriation. Precisely. Oh, okay, I don't have to explain the whole theory, but I think that is really the basic difference between Derrida's use of the term and our use. But we, for our part, should not hesitate to affirm that this connection, the connection between the sign and the object, derives from the hesitation. It derives from the deferral itself, which is in the first place the putting aside of conflictive mimetic violence. For hesitation within a constituted paradigm is only understandable as a real anthropological or even anthropogenetic act when it takes the form of a hesitation to take action in a situation where there is likewise a real danger of intraspecific conflict. And precisely, GA's simplest definition of the human is as the unique animal who, its mimetic intelligence having passed a certain threshold, is of greater potential danger to itself than is external nature. I think that is the simplest way of defining the human without talking about languages, that humans are more of a danger to themselves than the rest of the world is. We have to worry about the dangers of other humans before we worry about the dangers from nature. Why would signs multiply when the one originary sign had produced peace? In the space of deferral, all things are in contact with the sacred and potentially invested with significance. The sacred is at first the violent that must be avoided. This is sort of a Girardian line. But this violence is not an abstraction. It is rather the product of the appetite aroused by the central object. It would be better to say not that the sacred is the violent is the sacred, which is pretty much a quote from Girard. La violence c'est le sacré. Because the title of his novel is La violence et le sacré, but A, as somebody was saying this afternoon, you know, ET, it's also EST, so la violence et le sacré. But that's a little too simple. But that the sacred is the violent whose violence has been deferred. In the space of this deferral, the sign is not a simple abstraction, but a form that evokes its object, and in the communal peace thus established, however fleetingly, the differences among objects become possible objects of observation. Thus, the traces of experience can come to be incorporated into a language, a set of syntagmatic possibilities whose various positions are indeed, as Derrida saw, filled by choosing within paradigms. All of this, of course, is not present at the origin, but it begins at the origin with the phenomenon of deferral, without putting instinct aside to instead represent to each other the object of our instinctive appetite. In other words, really only need one word to create language. Once you have one word, you already have a binary contrast, because you have a contrast between that and everything else. And that, distinguishing that, is already creating the possibility of a syntax, because then I could say, well, that's important, but then that's important, and how do I distinguish the two? And I start, you know. In a passage whose positive nature is visible through the veil of precautions dictated by philosophical prudence, Derrida, much more explicitly than in the chapter that actually bears this title, gives us a glimpse of what his Grammatology as a positive science, that's a quote, might have looked like. This is a discussion of Lévi-Strauss's famous writing lesson from Triste Tropique. This was mentioned this afternoon. The anthropologist, having demonstrated the use of writing, this is Lévi-Strauss, having demonstrated the use of writing to an Amazonian tribesman, the latter creates, by scribbling lines on a paper, a written document of his own to impress his fellow tribesmen with his authority. And Derrida talks about this as writing in a well, actually, Lévi-Strauss already talks about this as writing in a somewhat literal fashion. But it's clear to me that it's not just the writing; it's the fact that he claims that the Western, the white man, the European gave him this, and that's what the source of the authority of the document is. But nevertheless, it's the idea of the document as a source of authority, and and this is the so-called leçon d'écriture. In other words, we are destroying the beauty of these native cultures by teaching them the sort of evil phenomena that are linked to writing, and therefore to the imposition of authority and to the end of the egalitarianism of these simple social groups. So here the question is raised as to the relationship between the birth of writing systems, in the narrow sense, that is real writing, and hierarchical power. We find in this passage a rare, perhaps unique example in Derrida of the use of the word différer, that is to defer, and so on, in a very nearly Girardian sense. And this is a quote, it's actually my translation, but it has long been known that the power of writing in the hands of a small number, of a caste or a class, has always been contemporary with hierarchization. which we will call political différence, and here the différence with an A, which is both the distinction among groups, classes, and levels of economico-techno-political power, and the delegation of authority, a power deferred, abandoned to a means of capitalization. That is, the existence of written documents defer the power that is possessed by the people who create them, like, like an arrest warrant or something. This phenomenon had been going on since the beginning of sedentary life, with the constitution of stocks at the dawn of agricultural societies, that is, the Neolithic. All this structure appears as soon as a society begins to live as a society. That is to say, with the origin of life in general. That's a strange thing, right? Dès l'origine de la vie en général. He didn't say human life, he says life in general. That's where I somehow got the sense that he was trying to make this into a kind of theory of everything, in the sense that the idea of writing is something that can explain the origin of life, because, you know, if you have DNA, then you can talk about the origin of life as the retention of the trace, in the sense that the DNA retains the trace of previous cells of a previous generation, and therefore permits reproduction. But he never goes on with it. But I do find that dès l'origine de la vie en général is rather striking. When on quite heterogeneous levels of organization and complexity, it becomes possible to defer presence, that is, expenditure. The French word is la dépense. It has a lot of resonances, Georges Bataille and so on, or consumption, and to organize production, that is, the reserve in general. In other words, if you have agriculture and you can conserve your stocks, then then you can begin to have possessions. You can have food that you don't eat right away, and so you can become rich. And then others who are poor, you can gain power over them by distributing the food and so on, and gaining authority by that. This takes place long before the appearance of writing in the narrow sense. That is, these accumulations take place well before people start actually doing writing. Yet it is true, and we cannot neglect this fact, that the appearance of certain writing systems 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, well after the beginning of the Neolithic period, was an extraordinary leap forward, and here again he uses the expression in the history of life. So here he's talking about deferral in a fairly concrete sense of the deferral of power. Not the deferral of choosing in a paradigm, but that the writing allows for deferral of the power, that I have power, but I don't have to exercise that power by hitting you over the head. I can write down something, and if I'm the king, sign it with my seal, and then you have to obey, because my authority is being transmitted via this document. This deferred power of authority in the universe of writing is, in GA terms, nothing but a new form of the deferral of the so-called aborted gesture of appropriation that leads to the omission of the sign in our originary scene. The difference is nonetheless fundamental, whereas for GA, the dominance of the sacred center with respect to the periphery reflects the hypothesis that the human emerges in escaping the hierarchy of the animal world, and this is a point which would involve a big digression. But my basic idea is that this originary scene takes place with the breakdown of the kind of pecking order that you see in the great apes, as well as many other animals, where you have not a real social system, but you simply have a series, a pecking order, where you have an alpha animal, and he's the one who goes first, and then after he's had what he wants, the beta animal comes along. And there's no sense of a social organization. It just means that the strongest one goes first, and the others, and if you want to challenge him, you challenge him one-on-one. There isn't any, in other words, it's not a social contract. And so my idea is that you have this essentially unequal system of distribution. But if you have enough mimesis in the group, to use a Girardian term, if the animals are, more and more imitative, they get to the point where, and here you have something like Freud's totem and taboo scenario, you have something like, well, why does he get the first piece? Well, I'm just as good as he is. And so you start to get conflicts. And you can imagine that there were many, many conflicts before the scene that I describe somewhat idealistically as a point where the animals are all afraid to grasp the central object of desire, meaning a piece of food, basically, or an animal that they found somewhere, because they fear from each other the wrath of the those who didn't get the first piece. And so the idea is, and it's really Adam Katz who came up with the idea that you shouldn't say they all hesitated once, but that one, there's always someone who goes first. And so the first person to begin to hesitate and to avoid conflict, then the others will imitate him because, and we assume this is mostly males because, females are less aggressive. But in any case, that is the origin of the originary scene as I depicted. In other words, this leads to egalitarianism. They all basically grab a piece, but at first they all hesitate, and the object in the center becomes a kind of a sacred object. And it's after that they divide it up. And there are many examples of that kind of division, including the famous Robertson Smith camel sacrifice that Girard likes to quote. I think Freud quotes. In fact, so that's some background here. So the difference is fundamental because for GA, the dominance of the sacred center with respect to the periphery reflects the hypothesis that we emerged by escaping the hierarchy. So that was what I was explaining, the hierarchy of the animal world, the alpha-beta hierarchy. Derrida, while attempting to situate writing in the broad sense at the origin of humanity, or even at that of the history of life itself, can only understand its accumulation of a reserve of power within the framework of a hierarchy. This situation of human hierarchy at the origin is precisely the defining postulate of postmodern victimary thought. This is something I've been working on lately. I won't go into that, but I think that's that's significant. In other words, Derrida basically thinks that the human begins hierarchically. If, after all, writing is the fundamental human relationship with signs, and writing in the broad sense is the definition of the human. Without writing, you don't have the human. And if that type of deferral is always associated with hierarchy, then you have to say that the originary scene of the human, in whatever terms you would like to put it in Derrida's vocabulary, is essentially hierarchical, whereas in my view, the human begins by creating equality among the members because the sign is something we can all share. Before we start jumping on the object and tearing it to pieces and each taking our own piece, we all have the sign. The sign can be shared equally by anyone. That's sort of a brilliant idea, isn't it? You can't share an object equally in any simple way, but you can always share a sign. One more person comes along and he can produce the sign as well as the others. That is, after all, it's a peace-bringing operation. Doesn't mean, of course, that after that no one ever fights, but it defers conflict. Here's another quote that I thought was interesting. Thus, in the chapter entitled On Grammatology as a Positive Science, in which Derrida might have been expected to begin to develop his own positive science of writing by integrating his discovery of la différence into the history of life in general, as he puts it, after a lengthy discussion of the historiography of writing systems, which is very learned, but it's a little bit off the topic, he ends with a sentence paragraph that fills an entire page with a long series of denunciations of the servility of writing in the service of power. I have a long quote here, but I'll shorten it. It's a whole page, really. It begins that the access to the written sign ensures the sacred power to make existence maintain itself in its trace and to know the general structures of the universe, that all clerizes, whether or not they exercise political power, were established at the same time as writing, and so on and so forth. All this refers us to a common radical possibility that no determinate science, no abstract discipline can think as such. We can't think it because if we begin with writing, which is always already a kind of giving in to power and an acceptance of a hierarchy, we can't think it in the way he'd like to think it, which is outside of the hierarchy, in other words, sort of in itself. Here we may observe that Derrida's refusal to see in the néant of deferral anything other than a deconstruction of the scene of presence, which in his view constitutes not the human as such, and this is, you find this especially in his work on Husserl, the idea of the presentness of language is something which I think Derrida is quite right to deconstruct. That in other words, you aren't present in your speech the way the phenomenologists like to think. But the myth of so you have this myth of the human, which is, and of the human group where everyone is present to each other. And Derrida denounces this as a kind of myth where the charismatic leader is sort of controlling the group by having them all, like, you know, as I'm controlling you right now, you see, making you all into my slaves. But well, you know, some people do it better than others, but, you know, I mean, you know, people like Hitler. No, but seriously, that is the sort of image he has of presence. He uses the term presence as a kind of a very negative term, as a myth of human presence, meaning that I control you by using language, and you feel the presence of my language because I pretend that this language sort of emanates from me as a kind of an absolute truth, when in effect, in reality, this language is deferral. It's all spoken through difference, but you're not supposed to notice the difference, and that's what he is revealing. And he began to do this, I think, in a very useful way by talking about phenomenology and Husserl, and where you can't simply say that language is, you know, you speak the language, and when you're speaking it sort of is right there in your mouth and that kind of thing. That is, I think, a false view, and I think that's where Derrida's that was where his first intuition came from, and that's why I say that his philosophy comes from this, you know, real revelation of deferral that is in itself authentic. However, somewhat troubling are his later adaptations of it. So that this myth of presence and the sacred created by power is directly linked, I think, to the late revolutionary passion, so typical of the European intellectuals of his generation, and even of ours, that consists in seeing humanity's original sin of inequality as in fact originary, inherent in the very use of signs that makes us human. The consequence of this is that ignoring the egalitarian relationships among the members of the simplest human societies, which is quite well attested, Derrida equates the birth of the sign with the birth of hierarchy, as if an asymmetrically superior father figure, on the example of Freud's totem and taboo, furnished us with our model of a subject divinity. Here's another passage that I think is somewhat useful. And this is a passage from the later chapter on Rousseau's Essai sur l'origine des langues, which Derrida makes much of. It's an essay that Rousseau never published, but where he says some very interesting things about language that he doesn't quite say in his much more famous essay on l'origine de l'inégalité. And so this is a quote from not from Rousseau, but from Derrida. So here, this is about as clear as Derrida ever is in sort of dealing with Rousseau's anthropology and whether or not he agrees with it. Because there's always a kind of tension. So this is Derrida. Between the family as a natural society and the organization of civil society, there are relations of analogy and image. And then he quotes from Rousseau. This is a quote from Rousseau. The chief is the image of the father. The people is the image of the citizens, of the children. And all being equal and free only alienate their freedom for their own benefit. And the Rousseau's term is pour leur utilité, for their own usefulness. The only difference is that in the family, the father's love for his children repays him for the services he renders them, and in the state, the pleasure of rule replaces that of love. Supplé, one of Derrida's favorite words, the supplement. Language is a supplement because of the lack, because of precisely the différence. This creates this nothingness between you and the object, and so you supplement it with added forms that make your victims forget about it, so to speak. And here you have the idea the father is willing to give services to his children, and he's repaid by love, but if you are a chief, you get benefits, that is the so-called the pleasure of rule, but the pleasure of rule, of course, also involves taking rather than just giving. Now, he quotes Rousseau, but he never responds to this. And when he gives me the impression, at least, I'm not sure if every Derridian agrees, but he gives the impression that this is pretty much how he sees it. He did not see it, of course, in terms of any... What he's trying to show is that there's no real moment when you become human. It's always a kind of a moving boundary. And so the difference between the father and the chief that Rousseau is trying to make into a definition of the difference between the animal father and the human chief is elided. So Derrida's point here is that the dichotomy that Rousseau draws between nature and culture is never definable. The supplementary transformation of family love into love of power must be related, and he later relates it to the incest prohibition, which Derrida then shows to be undefinably natural and cultural in Rousseau's text, and presumably in any text. But in revealing this undefinable glissement, or slippage, Derrida, in effect, accepts Rousseau's non-transition between animal and human hierarchy, between the father and the chief, leaving aside Rousseau's point that as children all are equal and free. This is a further quote of the from that same text. He says, you know, I already quoted this. He says, the chief is the image of the father, the people is the image of the children, and all, being equal and free, only alienate their freedom for their own benefit. So Rousseau, in other words, sees the origin, the originary relationship as that of equals, and that the chief is just sort of helping out the equals, but he's not really superior. And that's why he talks about the pleasure of rule rather than any kind of more concrete source of income, for instance. But you can see that Rousseau himself is not very clear about this. If you have a chief, well, how can he not have more power than the others, and therefore how can his pleasure of rule be a purely abstract one? And so clearly Rousseau is talking about a kind of hierarchy, and Derrida seems to go along with that, in fact using that almost as a kind of a demonstration that the only difference being that there isn't any real boundary between the father and the chief. That's all nature and culture, or basically can never be separated. This citation of Rousseau's father-chief filiation cannot bear the weight of an affirmation of causality, nor is the passage from animal to human hierarchy marked here as it is in Freud's famous father-murder scenario in Totem and Taboo, where all the sons get together and kill the father and redistribute the women, which is obviously something that, you know, someone like Derrida had in mind. But on the contrary, it is elided just as the direction of dependency of hierarchy with respect to writing, that is language and deferral, is undecidable. In effect, no light can be shed on the original sin of the sign in the absence of an explicitly originary theory of the human, that is GA, basically. For Derrida, the sign always already embodies, before the exploitation of man by man, the original sin of non-presence, and in consequence the supplementary myth of presence, which is a form of exploitation in itself. It goes without saying that none of this is simply chimerical. In order that a hierarchy may emerge later, its possibility must from the outset be an attribute of the human as created by the sign, and therefore an inherent possibility of representation in general. The space of deferral born in reciprocity is one into which hierarchy can always insert itself. The passage from firstness to equality in the originary event, in other words, one guy sort of withdraws his gesture of appropriation and somehow realizes that he's not just pulling back, but that he's at the same time designating the object as something that he's not taking. In other words, that is sacred, and therefore don't jump on me, I'm not taking the thing, but also by the fact that I'm designating it, it's infinitely significant. It's so important that I can't possess it, which is the relationship that we have to the sacred. So this is you know, the sort of originary scenario that I've been talking about. But so none of this is chimerical. In order to do that, the firstness of the first gesture is absorbed within the group. They all imitate it. But that doesn't mean that firstness in itself has disappeared. And once you have something like the Neolithic and the ability to accumulate agricultural goods, then firstness returns as a way, you know, the so-called big man who accumulates more food than the others and who can then distribute it to the others and participate in rituals where he gives out the food. Well, this is the first step to becoming a chief, and then a king, and then an emperor. Right, so so Derrida is right to see the relationship between hierarchy in the human sense and the sign, but it isn't some kind of an automatic relationship. You can certainly have signs without hierarchy. The space of deferral born in reciprocity is one into which hierarchy can always insert itself. but the passage from firstness to equality in the originary event is not guaranteed by the structure of the scene itself, once other factors such as the surplus intrude. But it seems to me that at the very beginning, you can't really justify hierarchy. The whole problem was hierarchy. The problem is hierarchy broken down by mimesis. The alpha animal isn't strong enough to hold off all the others. You can't have an organization like that once you have too much mimesis in the organization. It is in this space of deferral that the preservation of the trace as language takes on its uniquely human character, one that gives the lie to attempts such as Engels' dialectic of nature to see human cultural systems as merely a more complex variant of pre-human systems. Derrida's reluctance to develop the hints that he drops about writing's place in the history of life in general should be explained less as a failure of nerve than as a reaction of prudence. Derrida intuitively understands that when metaphysics refuses to think the origin of language, that is its way of sacralizing language, not of reducing it to a phenomenon of nature. Similarly, the deferral that deconstructs this metaphysical sacralization, however unanthropologically explained, is never other than a specifically human concept. Let's see how much time I have here. Probably been talking a little too long. How much more time should I have?
You're fine.
Well, I'm sort of, I don't know. I don't want to, bore you guys too much. Well, let me zip through this part. I tried about 2 decades ago in an article called Plato and the Birth of Conceptual Thought, which came out in Anthropoetics in January of 1997. I tried to show what unites the two great components of Western civilization, the Hebrew and the Greek, and they're united in an explicit faith in the objectivity of language as represented in its mature form by the declarative sentence or proposition. And the declarative sentence, which involves predication and therefore creates a notion of truth, which can be traced in Greek philosophy, or the consciousness of which can be traced in Greek philosophy to Parmenides, and the notion of the way of truth as making true sentences as opposed to sentences that just acquire belief, the way of the doxa or opinion. So, I mean, in the origin of language, I tried to develop a way in which the declarative could be born from a failed imperative that if you ask for something, but I won't go into that, that's not really necessary. But what's interesting is that if you look at Greek philosophy, it begins essentially in Platonic, in the hard metaphysical sense of Plato. It begins with the notion that you have things like the good, which can be defined as universal. And I think my view of this is that the good becomes something that can be spoken of as universal when it becomes subject to predication. And in other words, when you believe that the declarative sentence is the kind of originary and basic form of language, which is not the case for GA, where we believe that the originary language was essentially an ostensive pointing, and it's only later that it developed the idea of a truth value that can be used in the declarative. But Plato's philosophy, and what people have called metaphysics ever since, is really, or at least since Aristotle, is the idea that you can have certain nouns that can be spoken truly of, and the fact that these nouns exist allows one to make a predicate, to postulate values about the world which otherwise can't be deduced simply from language itself. And the greatest example of this is the good, which he talks about in the Gorgias in particular, and also in the Republic. But, when Callicles says, well, my good is that I want to take this thing, so I'm going to take it. Well, Socrates says, no, the good. It's not indexical. In other words, it's not my good and your good. It's the good. Well, how does he know that? It's always seemed to me that that's the basis of, that's what philosophy really is about. It's about how can the polis exist? How can we have a harmonious social order? And the way we do it is by postulating, almost a priori, if you want, we postulate that there is a good. And so if there is a good, then you can't do something that violates that. And therefore I have a way of explaining to Callicles that not only is he doing a bad thing, but that he's violating his own need, because we all want the good. We all desire the good. And, in a way, it's a kind of a social contract that dares not say its name. But the point is that philosophy is based on this possibility of declarative sentences. And then I noticed that if you look at the Bible in Exodus 3, when Moses asked God his name, he says, I am that I am, or Eya Asher Eya, that is, I am, or I will be what I will be. And here you have giving his name as a declarative sentence. And this is a point that I've elaborated a great deal. I don't want to go into much detail on this, but it seems to me that a rather important point that these two sources of Western civilization are both based on the notion that the declarative sentence is above any kind of ostensive pointing and any form of any possibility of a name that individuals could call out to. In other words, instead of saying, yes, my name is Yahweh, as people like to say, he says, no, he says, my name is I am that I am. In other words, you can't call on me, you can't pronounce my name and get some benefits from it. And this is the origin of monotheism. And so it's interesting to see that you have these two phenomena that are essentially parallel, that the faith in the declarative, faith in the objectivity of language is common to both the Greek and the Jewish or the Hebrew sources of Western civilization. Then, so I say, from the standpoint of a certain irony, one might find it bizarre that of the two chief sources of Girard and Derrida, it would be the Christian and not the Jew who is revealed as the more faithful guardian of this great Old Testament truth, while the Jew is the one who, having deconstructed metaphysics, that is Greek thought, as the source of all serious thinking, finds nothing remaining but deconstructed metaphysics. Derrida, in his old age, sort of became more interested in religion, but at the time when he was really creating these ideas, he wouldn't have thought to make this parallel. He will deconstruct Plato's notion of the good, but he won't see that there's a parallel there with this religious basis, which allows for a sense in which religion itself can understand its need for objectivity. He always associates religion with authority, precisely. Derrida always associates religion with the priests and with the whole notion of centralized authority and the false presence that I've been talking about. Whereas here you see in his own Jewish tradition, God saying, my name is I am that I am. So don't come asking me for any favors, of course. It's not as simple as that, but that is the fundamental, I think the most significant theological statement in human history, I would venture to say, because it leads to Christianity and all the rest. But Derrida doesn't see that. That's the point I was trying to make. To my mind, the greatest contribution of René Girard to Western thought is to have understood that of the two currents that flow together to form the Western soul, it is the Hebrew current that is the more authentically anthropological, and that alone has allowed the Greek to spread over an entire continent and finally to the entire planet. In other words, that of the kind of combination of Greek and Hebrew that you find in Christianity, that it's really the Hebrew part is the most significant. Not that the Greek part isn't, but without the Hebrew part, the Greek part wouldn't have been able to spread itself over the world and create science and modern technology. If Girard taught me one thing, and I do like to say that I am Girard's first doctoral student, If Girard taught me one thing, it is not to waste time seeking spurious philosophical profundities, but to find elaborated in the great literary tradition of the West the anthropological truths first enunciated in the Bible. For it is there that we encounter more clearly than elsewhere the originary truth concerning human violence and the unique defense that humanity has erected against it. Representation, language, religion, culture, the declarative sentences that are the guarantees of peace do not emerge as the philosophers would have it all by themselves. They come from the center of the scene where violence has been concentrated in detaching itself from human appetite, the center that in order for us to understand its uniqueness must, and this is the great Hebrew revelation, must name itself with the non-name of God. Eyer, Asher, Eyer. It is in a most significant historical discovery, Seth Sanders demonstrated in the invention of Hebrew, which came out in 2009, that the biblical Hebrew world, in that world, alphabetic writing, far from being an instrument of authoritarian domination, was rather a tool of proto-democratic liberation. the Hebrew world of alphabetic writing, characterized by a much higher rate of literacy than was typical in the societies of the time, where cuneiform writing was confined to a guild of scribes. These are people who sort of learned writing in the modern sense. Cuneiform, you have to have clay tablets, and the signs are rather hard to read, and so they were really only transmitted by professional scribes. Whereas apparently, according to Sanders, in the beginnings of this Jewish tradition, you start to see manuscripts written on papyrus or whatever, and that can be created by anybody, and that this alphabet is much easier to read than the cuneiform type of alphabet, which is syllabic rather than based on individual sounds. And so you have a whole flourishing of alphabetic writing, and this sort of gives the lie to some of Derrida's ideas about the relation of writing and tyranny. So here you have the democratization of writing. And so our generative reflection on the human takes its point of departure from the liberating différence that is affected by the écriture of the Old Testament. Finally, I think what allows us to equate, and that's why I think I can say that GA is a form of, is grammatology. In other words, we respect the writing because it's the writing of the Old Testament that eventually led to the kind of freedoms that we have today to think these things. That's really there where you see people starting to use language, written language, and of course also in Greece you have the beginnings of the Homeric tradition, but that's something somewhat less directly connected to what I'm talking about. Finally, I think what allows us to equate GA with grammatology, the theory and history of the retention of the trace, is that Derrida's grammatology was never really a positive science, despite the passing temptation we've noted toward a history of life and so on, an impulse that has never tempted GA. To the extent that GA can inspire a positive science of history, this positive nature would be essentially retrospective. We must be able to explain the past, but to explain at the same time how the past does not let us, save in the narrowest terms, predict the future. It seems to me that la différence, understood as the originary néant, this is a Sartrean term, or free space of our grammatology, is ideally adapted to this role, for it is in this space of reflection that those who participate in the scene free themselves from the scene, and that is, appear upon the other scene, which is not that of the unconscious, or not in a Freudian sense, but that on which we can contemplate the real world, or if we like, recording Gaston Bachelard, that of the laboratory. Its language produces a laboratory in your brain, and I think Professor Tallis will more or less agree with that idea, that the language is a place where you can think things through, but it also allows you to develop real laboratories where you actually pick out what parameters you want to test and put them in an environment where you can test them, the origin of modern science. So it is by deferring their tendency to mimetic violence, to speak in Girardian terms, that humans find the means to explore the world, and in so doing that they find the material means that facilitate other forms of deferred exchange, at first that of the gift analyzed by Marcel Mauss, and finally that of the free market. So let me try to conclude here, because this is getting a little too long. So here's one final observation. Those familiar with GA know that its fundamental configuration is that of the scene. Language and other forms of representation, however they are practiced by individuals, are only understandable as manifesting themselves on a scene, which is not in principle an individual but a communal space. But then, one might say, the fundamental state of affairs suggested by the term grammatology might be incompatible with GA, because you imagine the writer isolated from the reader, inscribing signs that conserve the trace of an idea, and certainly Derrida's critique of presence is on the surface an expression of anti-scenicity and a denial that a human scene can ever truly be actualized. But however distasteful, I must say, I used to find Derrida's politics, it would be unfair to his thought to take his denial of presence in a narrow sense. There is indeed a naive conception of immediacy that the history of metaphysics adopts, and that Rousseau in particular exemplifies as a guarantee of pre-romantic communion. But by opening within human interaction the space of deferral, and even in calling it écriture, Derrida is not in fact denying the human scene, but adding the most significant element to its description. I have pointed out that Sartre's néant does essentially the same thing, but Sartre doesn't see the néant in terms of the human community. He just sees the individual mind, the human being free because you have this nothingness between you and the world, but he doesn't see this as language, and he doesn't see it as a communal space. Whereas in Derrida's notion of non-presence is already a form of human interaction that GA merely, so to speak, optimistically translates as the real cultural presence of human beings to each other. Presence which precisely includes this nothingness and therefore includes the freedom that Sartre was looking for. And it is here that I find the justification, at least for the purpose of giving us all a useful shock of calling GA a grammatology. Derrida is right to insist that the mode of communication in speech and in a 3,000-year-old inscription are essentially the same. The virtual scene on which we encounter the one is not essentially different from the real scene on which we encounter the other. One thing that I've said tonight, I'd like you to retain, it's that Derrida talks about writing, and he sort of deconstructs the notion of speech as immediacy. Well, he's right. There is no immediacy in speech. The difference between reading an old book and listening to a speaker is basically unimportant. It's the same kind of communication because it's mediated through the scene of representation, not by some kind of immediate presence. And of course, if Hitler is the one who's speaking, you might forget about that, but that's not because of Hitler's, whether Hitler's speaking or whether you're reading Mein Kampf, is the same thing, It's not because he's there making the speech, it's the nastiness of what he's saying that's so that the virtual scene on which we encounter speech and on which we encounter writing are essentially the same. Because scenes as such, that is human scenes, are never real in the sense of a pre-human instinctual contact with the world and with others. The danger of the notion of a scene, a danger that Girard's emissary murder has not altogether escaped, because he sees the origin of the human in essentially an instinctive lynching, where the mimetic tensions that I talk about in terms of my pointing lead rather to murder than to restraint. And I always question how you get the real human out of that. He always talks about, well, afterwards they stand back and sort of look at the thing. Well, maybe, but he never formalizes this in a theory of language. The danger of this notion is the illusion of immediacy on what Eric Voegelin calls, in a broader context, compactness. These societies like the old empires where you couldn't possibly dream of contradicting the emperor, he was God, and so on. Voegelin was not fond of compactness, a feature of the societies of the archaic god, king, emperors, because it was a figure of unfreedom. In contrast, deferral, whatever the politics of its creator, is a figure of freedom. The form of communication called écriture, to emphasize its non-immediacy, is likewise a manifestation of human freedom. And it is in this sense that I think that we can call GA an understanding of the human in terms of its écriture, that is, a grammatology. Thank you. Sorry, I went on a little too long there.
No, not at all.
Shorter text.
Oh, thank you very much, Eric. And soon you'll be able to ask questions, but before you do so, we have a respondent to Eric's talk by my colleague, Evelyn Cobley. Evelyn Cobley, as I said, is my colleague. She's been teaching in the English department at UVic since 1984, when she was hired in those heady days as the department's theorist, right? First theorist. And I have to say I was grateful for that, because in the early 90s, as we were discussing earlier, I was taking Evelyn's courses as an undergraduate at UVic, and so she kind of introduced me to some of these ideas, particularly Derrida. I think the first course was on narratology, wasn't it? And one of my other colleagues, who unfortunately isn't here today, Toby Fauché, or now Raphael Fauché, who was the department's second theorist, actually introduced me to well, Girard's work, but also Gans's work. So there's a kind of sentimental, personal significance, I guess, to Evelyn's agreeing to act as a respondent, and I'm deeply grateful for her for doing so. Not the least of which reasons is that she had to withdraw herself from part of a tennis tournament. And if you know Evelyn at all, well, that's a big deal. So please welcome Evelyn Cobley.
Well, having listened to you talk, I had a written version of this, but listening to it changes it somehow. There's so many observations that you're making in this talk that I really honestly don't know where to start. And I have this prepared speech here, which I probably won't read because now I'm having all kinds of other...
too long.
No, I have a set of totally different questions from the ones I had after I had just read it. I myself don't know a whole lot about generative anthropology, so I'm a sort of interloper in this conference. As Richard pointed out, I'm more on the side of Derridian deconstruction. But I did, in fact, read a lot of Girard in my very early days. I even used some of his theories in one of my early papers. And I did read some of Eric Gans's early sort of responses to Girard. But all this was so long ago, I don't really remember much about it. So my questions really come then from the Derridian end, and I guess we're just probably just not quite on the same page on this. The way I understand Derrida does probably not totally correspond to the way you're understanding Derrida, and that doesn't mean that I'm right and you're wrong. It just means I'm not quite, I'm a little bit puzzled sometimes. In particular, the notion of différence, and I know you're speaking French and you're well aware of the fact that in French we have just one word, where we have two in English. We have to defer and to differ, whereas in French we just have différence, initially with an E. It still has the two meanings implied. And for Derrida, I think the important thing is not just that you have deferral implied here, but also that at the same time the term also means to differentiate. So you have the spatial and the temporal. And I think he was particularly interested in the tension between these two, in the kind of aporetic relationship that they both simultaneously attract and conflict with each other. So I was just wondering whether you were kind of singling out deferral without whether you're paying enough attention to the other, the more spatial consideration of that term. That was actually my sort of first response to your paper, where I was probably more interested in how, you know, in that kind of moment of aporetic non-coincidence there. I think I think Derridian deferral does definitely help me to understand how generative anthropology is understanding the way in which we move from how representation actually defers violence, and I think that really was very helpful to me to understand that, because of course for Derrida too, the signifier can always only stand in for the signified that cannot manifest, that cannot present itself. And so in that sense, I think this does allow you to clarify how you in many ways differ from Girard, whose primary focus, as I seem to remember, was on violence itself rather than on its deferral. And I think this is all highly productive, even though my sense of Derrida may not always be quite in alignment with your argument. The other question I had about your paper is that in in your discussion of the, what seems to be fairly central to your argument, your reading of Derrida's reading of Lévi-Strauss's writing lesson. It seems to me that you and Derrida sort of disagree on your reading of Rousseau, where for Derrida, I mean, you agree with Derrida, I think, where Derrida says, well, this concept that there was a kind of, originally we're all harmoniously living, and then writing appeared, and suddenly we became, you know, that was kind of corrupting some kind of original innocence. And you're saying there was always already originary violence, which in fact was deferred by the introduction of writing. And of course for Derrida, writing continues to be violent. And I think for me, why Derrida is convincing to me is that for him writing is of course that kind of inside-outside opposition, where we always because writing categorizes, therefore words always include and exclude. And for him, I think what I found very interesting in Derrida's thinking is that he pays attention to the whole web of associations and so on, and that, you know, the glissement that you were briefly alluding to, that to me is very central. And therefore, when you always have this kind of glissement, this seems to me, and the whole notion of différence seems to me to undermine any appeal to an origin. I mean, I'm sure that you're aware of that critique. And so for me, Derrida is still somewhat more convincing in that he argues that we can never actually pinpoint an origin, so that for him there could in fact not be that moment that you are trying to, I think, identify where we move from animal to human, because for him, quite rightly, as you quite rightly point out, this boundary, the two would be mutually implicated. And you haven't quite convinced me on that, is what I'm trying to say. And my last point, I mean, I haven't read any of what I was going to say, but my last point was, however, your comment on Derrida's politics. What do you find so distasteful about his politics? And more importantly, what I would like to hear about a little bit more from you is what the political implications are of generative anthropology. There's the kind of, you know, not being a generative anthropologist, I think the sacred is a somewhat puzzling notion for me.
I should have probably written down a few things that I think the first, your first point about the difference, it's true, and you know, let's face it, I'm not a student of Derrida. I kind of use Derrida's idea of deferral, so I haven't been as faithful to him as I might have been, but I feel though that the essence of his notion of différence is precisely to add to difference. Philosophers have always talked about difference. Difference is, you know, Heidegger wrote an essay on difference. The nice one that things can be different is a kind of, in a way, the fundamental philosophical problem. I mean, you know, how do I know that this chair is different from the door? What is it about it, you know, that makes it different? Well, I think that the real problem is that difference is something that requires language. You know, if you don't have language, you know, things are different. They evoke different behaviors, but you can't really, you know, I mean, I hate to put it this way, but you can't talk about anything without language. So you have to have language to create difference. And I think that the genius of this idea of différence is precisely that if you want to have difference, you have to defer your judgment. And that's why he uses this example of the paradigm. In other words, you know, you have red, green, and blue. And so if I say red, well, I'm not really saying red. I'm saying it's red, that it isn't green or blue. In other words, I'm choosing from a paradigm, and that involves a certain hesitation, if you like, a certain stepping back in order to create a possibility of difference so that I can have different responses in a given situation. I have to be able to somehow reflect on that. And I think that's why but then I say, you know, from my standpoint, one word is enough. In other words, sacred and profane is the only binary you really need. And so it's less important that you have 6 different colors. And furthermore, if you think about it, when you say red, you're not really thinking about blue and green. What you're really thinking about is, I want to say that's red. You know, you see red things all day long, but why am I saying red? It's because for some reason that's significant. And then, you know, but the point is though that the difference is only possible, and I think here I'm being faithful to Derrida, it's only possible to measure difference, to say, to categorize things in different ways if you can defer your judgment. In other words, there's no immediacy about your choice of the specific term, and that I think is his essential point. And I think that's one of the great discoveries of, that's the true, if you like, overcoming of the metaphysical, which is something that, say, the Husserlian thinks that, you're present in your speech, that kind of thing. I think that's where he got that from. It's unsatisfaction, being unsatisfied with that originary point. Let's see if I can think of the glissement. Well, I mean, I realize, as Richard said, that I'm not in a minority on this, but I do think that people like, Terence Deacon and whatever, at least we've gotten beyond the idea that human language is really just a fancier version of animal language. That's at least something that has been pretty much, I mean, Terence Deacon, after all, is not a philosopher, he's essentially a neurologist or a neuroscientist, and, he makes the point that human language is not even located in the same part of the brain as these animal signal systems. It's really characteristically different. So that's one way of talking about it, but I think that it's more than that. You have a whole system of the human symbolic systems and so on. And even someone like Sartre, who's after all still kind of traditional philosopher, but his idea of the néant and freedom, all this depends on language. But I think that people have been trying to say that there's something absolutely different between humans and animals. And I think today, if anything, that passion to find them all the same has diminished a bit. It's not that long ago when everyone was teaching language to chimpanzees. And I think, after all, you don't know, right? Now, let's say 20 or 30 years ago, they were teaching kanji or whatever to use language, and people thought, well, if we really keep at it, we'll get these chimpanzees to be able to talk, let's say like children. Maybe they'll never speak as beautifully as Shakespeare, but at least they'll be able to say a few words. Well, it didn't work out. I mean, they got some level of communication, but you could never really distinguish it between a kind of stimulus response. In other words, the sort of argument that Chomsky gave to Skinner is still valid. Now, it's hard to talk about politics. Somebody who's politics I don't care for, certainly Chomsky, but Chomsky was absolutely right that you can't talk about language in terms of stimulus and response. As soon as you say that, I think you pretty much have to say that there's a distinction. In other words, human language doesn't come out of a signal system. It's a different system. And, so I'm trying to say that, and here's another point. Humans have events. This is an event. You can remember this event. Maybe not forever, but animals don't have events. Things happen to them, but there's no animal history. So when did the first event start? There has to be a first event. Now people say, oh well, that's that's infantile, that's naive. Well, why is it naive? If you don't have if there's no first event, then how do you get events? Why is this an event, and why wasn't there an event at the beginning? Now it could have been forgotten. It doesn't have to be that this one event everyone always remembers. But it's the idea that there's something about signs that allow you to retain the trace, as Derrida would put it, and it's la rétention de la trace, which I think, in Derrida's own term, shows that the human is not the animal. And if he talks about the history of life, well, he doesn't really develop that. He doesn't really show that DNA coding is really the same as language, because he doesn't really believe that. That's why I say we can use the term grammatology, because he really is making a human concept. I think, to take Derrida in his most I think, profound way, but I think, we can't ask him because he's not here anymore, but I think in his later years, certainly, I was very touched by a thing he wrote not too far before his death, where he talked about language as being based on faith. I imagine you probably know this text. I can't remember the name of the text, but I wrote about it in one of my chronicles. Well, language is based on faith. Well, what else am I telling you? In other words, faith is a communal thing. It's not... but in order to have that, you have to have this kind of hesitation or deferral. Now, as for Derrida's politics, that's a throwaway line. I don't want to get into a political argument about, so I just as soon not discuss that. I mean, Derrida's a thinker, and I'm interested in his thought and not the party he voted for. So that is something, I
thought you meant his politics as it came out of his theory. I didn't realize you meant his actual politics.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it was one of these European anti-Americans and so on and so forth, but I don't want to go into that. I don't think that's terribly relevant. But in any case, I'm trying to show that I have, you know, certain respect for Derrida, and I think that if you read him the right way, you would find that the glissement that he's talking about, you can push that off onto Rousseau, but I don't think that you can really push off his notion of écriture onto animals. And it seems to me that there's a contradiction between his, you know, playing around with culture, nature, and showing that people like Rousseau and Lévi-Strauss don't get it right, and saying that that means that that's what's really the case. I think he's really saying they don't get it right, but I get it right. There is the difference between the human and the animal is precisely l'écriture. It's la différence. Animals don't have la différence. Find a place in Derrida where he says that animals experience the différence. I don't think you really think. Is there anything else?
Well, in response to that, I mean, one of his recently very popular
books, on the cat.
About the cat, yeah. L'animal que donc je suis. I don't think in that he makes a distinction between
but you know, but let's face it, that's a kind of an editorial work. I mean, I can write a book about my cat, but I'm talking about when he's doing serious philosophy on the level of de la grammatologie or l'écriture et la différence or la pharmacie de Platon and that stuff. I mean, you don't see anything about this. Yeah, but I mean, it's also a kind of you know, a piece of provocation, right? You know, here's my pet snake. Well, he's just as smart as any of you. You know, he smiles at me, and we understand each other perfectly. You know, but I don't take that too seriously. I think that in his original work, though, when he talks about glissement, he never gives an example of anything anywhere near, I don't think, animals being capable of écriture. I think that's sort of significant. So. That doesn't make you convinced, maybe, but at least I don't think Derrida would back you up exactly by showing that glissement doesn't really exist. He just shows that the philosophers get it wrong, that they do too naively.
Yes, question of that?
Yeah, this is a question, just I'm kind of throwing it out for the audience, really. Because I think for anyone who's not familiar with generative anthropology, it's a pretty tall order to get a grip on it in the context of a discussion comparing it to Derrida. And I think it also kind of points at some of the comments that the respondent made. So in your talk, you situated both Derrida's thinking and your generative anthropology with respect to phenomenology, but you didn't really say as much about structuralism. And when you sort of take a first approach to what Derrida was doing, it usually helps people to understand it if you situate it both with respect to phenomenology and structuralism. And I was wondering if maybe you could just give the audience an idea about how generative anthropology fits into that context also. It might help people understand.
Yes, well, often Derrida's thought is spoken of as post-structuralist, and of course there's a major critique of Lévi-Strauss in de la Grammatology, which is one of the main features of this, and he tries to show that structuralism is really of the same type of thought that Rousseau represents and that metaphysics represents and so on. And so he's trying to show that structuralism, although it presents itself as a kind of revolutionary transformation of thought because it takes its structures from from reality and not from metaphysical presuppositions like the good. Nevertheless, it still operates according to metaphysical principles. I must say that in all the, I spent many years when I would teach Lévi-Strauss and company and so on. I've never really focused on that difference between GA and structuralism, because I think that, Lucien Goldman, whose name is probably not too familiar with to you now, but who was quite a well-known figure back in his own day, and who died, unfortunately, a bit prematurely, but he's the author of Le Dieu Caché, a study of Racine, and so on, who, in fact, sat on he was present at my doctoral oral at Hopkins, so I knew him slightly. But the point is that he had an idea, being a Marxist, he had an idea of what he called le structuralisme génétique. And I think that, you know, in some ways the word génétique, which was translated as generative, and the reason that I had to use that was, as Richard said, it was actually my editor, publisher, representative told me I can't call it, you know, genetic anthropology. It sounds too biological. But so the word génétique, or generative and generative anthropology, in a way comes from Goldman. And his idea of the genesis of structures, I thought is, you know, kind of an improvement over the notion of structuralism, where you have there's no clear way of getting from square one to square two. And if you read Lévi-Strauss, you know, especially in his later works, it's always a kind of fascinating exercise in him telling you here are the structures, but they never seem to really, he's always telling you the exceptions to them, you know. And so it's very hard to follow Lévi-Strauss's reasoning, although it seems very rigorous. In the days when he was writing about, you know, the système de parenté and all that, you know, he could have all these nice diagrams because you could say that you married a cross cousin and so on. But as soon as he gets into more complex type of things like his analysis of myths, it's pretty hard to talk about structure. Whereas I think Goldman at least had the idea as a research program, and something that I think you can see in his analyses of, say, Racine's plays, you know, you talk about the genesis of structures. And I was always attracted to that idea, and so I don't feel the need to deconstruct structuralism, but I think you have structures that evolve. Like, you know, I wrote my dissertation on Flaubert's early works. You know, he wrote a whole bunch of little things when he was 16 or 17. But if you read all 25 or 30 of them, you know, you see these interesting kinds of evolutions between one and the next. And you can say that the character, you know, like the father in this story is sort of like the father in that story. And I've always been fascinated by that sort of thing. And I, you know, in some in Goldman, but also in some other books on Racine, you know, he only wrote 12 plays, and you can sort of see the same configurations shifting around. So I think that structuralism seen that way is something I think relatively beneficial. I don't think that, you know, Derrida was concerned with that aspect of structuralism. I think he's more concerned with the idea of the sort of abstract notions of structure that he wants to show can't really be maintained. But if you historicize them, I think then structuralism becomes a method that I think is not only compatible, but in the sense that's what GAs should do, like as I tried to do in originary thinking and setting up a series of aesthetics from the classical to the neoclassical. I must admit I sort of neglected that aspect of it, but then I feel, you know, GA really existed, it's not just me, so. But I do think that GA lends itself to that, to the notion of historical evolution. Well, take, say, Girard's ideas about religion, which I've tried to remain somewhat faithful to by talking about how you get from Judaism to Christianity and so on. So you have these essentially structural. In other words, there are important events which shift the structures. You know, like when at the beginning of the Iliad, I love to quote this, right? The first word of the Iliad, Menin, is it's resentment. Achilles resents Agamemnon. So you have the very beginning of literature, and at the same, in other words, secular literature, and at the same time, the notion of resentment within the society. Well, isn't that a significant, you know, that's something new, and so that allows you to talk about a new structure, which is then can be implemented further, and so on. Or when you get from, say, a classical tragedy to Shakespearean tragedy, and you have the play within the play. You don't have plays within plays in Sophocles. It's a new form of, you know, way of dealing with the scene and so on. So you know, that may not really answer your question, but that's you know, so I can't answer really a concrete question about structure. It's too something that I see as something you have to think with structures, but I don't like the idea of structuralism as a kind of set of rigid structures.
Eric, thanks for your very considerate and forceful, powerful presentation tonight. What I was missing something though. What I was missing was appropriation. I mean, you've often talked, when we talk about the scene, the initial scene, as being the scene of appropriation that is itself stopping. It's an abortion of the scene of appropriation. So that when we choose the number for example, you gave the model of red. Where do we get red from? And you imagined this chart, and I kept thinking of Jakobson and the selection and the accommodation.
Yeah, right.
But before that, there's at least in your work, as I understand it, there's appropriation. So, I mean, I don't think you want to say, but maybe you do. Maybe you changed your mind on this. That appropriation, suddenly when language shows up, appropriation drops off. We still appropriate, right?
No, we still eat. In Girard's world, you don't eat anything. But in my, as you know, there's a famous line from French criticism, on mange beaucoup dans les romans de Flaubert, and I always like to say, well, on ne mange jamais dans le monde de Girard. But no, we, precisely the whole idea of the sacred, the whole idea of the sign, I mean, if you want to go on with this sort of scenario, it's instead of the alpha animal grabbing the first piece and then the beta animal and so on, they all have to hesitate, because they've had too many times when the alpha animal and the beta animal got into a big fight, and then they all, you know, messed it up. And as in Baudelaire's famous Le Gâteau, they fight over the cake so much that there's nothing left but crumbs. And so this idea of hesitating and of designating the object as something that one has to hesitate to appropriate becomes understood as a sign. And you know, we don't have to worry about how many hundreds of times this didn't work, but if it works at some point and the whole group gets the idea that this is how we designate the central object, then, according to my idea, this would be followed by a kind of a sparagmos situation where the members of the group would all realize that they can only get their one piece. They're not fighting each other off for the object, but everyone can share in it, and that's when they would share the object. And as I say, you do have examples of this in the literature, as the famous camel sacrifice, but there are many others. And the idea is in simple societies, in hunter-gatherer societies, there's a big deal made about equal pieces of meat and so on. And you never take more than your portion. And if you're one of the hunters, you don't eat more than the others. You bring the thing back to the tribe. And there are very elaborate systems of manners about how much to take and so on. And here's another point. You know, just as I always like Marcel Mauss, because his idea of the gift corresponds to how we all live, and not just some people in the jungle somewhere. Because, you know, if I invite you to dinner, then I've given you a gift, right? And then, you know, a few weeks later, maybe you invite me to dinner. But if I invite you to dinner, you don't pay me for the dinner, and you don't invite me the next day. And so we're really in the Maussian gift situation with our friends. Well, in the same way, if you think about it, what is the one thing that we all do today, we all do together? And, you know, we share food. And when you share food, you know, everyone gets approximately an equal piece. I mean, this is something we still do every day, you know, if you have, especially in moments like Thanksgiving dinners or Seders or whatever. And I think that's, you know, we can't laugh at that. That is how human beings live. Even now, with all the technology, it's not because you have a cell phone that it's going to make a difference in it. And I think that tells you something very fundamental about the human. If I go to dinner at your house and I, you know, the first thing I see the, you know, turkey there, and I rip off the two drumsticks and I put them on my plate, well, you're not going to invite me next year, right? Because I'm not dealing with you in the way human beings normally deal. So that's the appropriation is essential, but you want to appropriate it in a way that doesn't lead to conflict. And that's why the alpha animal system worked, as long as that type of, you know, mimesis was at a lower level, and so people just recognized, and you see this in same gangs, they still have a kind of alpha system, right? If you're in a gang, you know, at least, I don't know much about gangs, but, you know, the biggest guy gets the, you know, he gets the thing first, and then, you know, whatever he leaves, you know, he gives to the others, and so, well, because that's, but that only works within limits. But human societies can't organize that way because we're too mimetic. We're too, you know, after the guy does that a few times, a few of the other guys get together and say, hey, you know, why don't we do something about Joey? He's taking a big piece all the time, you know? See what I mean? I mean, Andrew's from Brooklyn, he understands this perfectly.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your talk. I also wanted to ask, just put a little more pressure on the question of the political, not Derrida's politics per se, but the political. So if the human is sort of characterized in GA as egalitarian and possessed of a certain freedom afforded by language, would political regimes that don't endorse or maximize those values be an affront to the human? Does GA make that distinction? And if so, does GA not have an obligation to recognize or discriminate between political regimes on that order? Another way of putting it would be, is every polis deserving of the name, or equally deserving of the name? That's a broad question that might address some of the question of politics in a way that is more appropriate to GA's own terms.
Well, you know, that's a kind of strategic question. In other words, is GA simply a way of talking about the human, or does it have certain ethical points to make? I think that the fundamental ethic, if you want to say GA has an ethic, the fundamental ethic, which is that of language, is that we all the same. We all share it. You know, you can't really imagine someone who can speak, who can understand a language but can't speak it, maybe when you're learning the language. But I mean, basically, language is reciprocal. Now, I may be the king, and I can force you to shut up and listen to me, but that's not the natural way language is used, right? A cat can look at a king is one way, maybe Derrida like that expression, but, you know, in other words, to the extent that GA has a kind of ethic, it's an ethic of egalitarianism. At the same time, you know, there's a whole Rawlsian component in ethics. You know, you need to have certain hierarchy to get things done and so on. So, but I think the point isn't for us to tell the world how to run itself. But one point one can make is that when you have a hierarchy, you have resentment. People resent any human difference. I think that's, if you need a proof of my notion of ethics or mine, it's simply resentment. You can't not resent. Now, maybe if you're really, you know, beaten down, you're a peasant and you work all day, you don't have time to resent much. But there's always going to be a resentment in there, because it's just not natural for, you know, A to talk to B and B not to be able to talk to A, for A to give orders to B and so on. So any kind of hierarchy requires some kind of compensation. I don't want to say that Rawls is a GA person, but I have written a bit about Rawls. I think he certainly tries better than anyone else to try to understand in what way one can justify hierarchy. But here's another point, which is also, you know, Adam's favorite term of firstness, or at least I've sort of stolen this term. I don't know if you agree with every use of it. The idea of firstness, I think, is significant, even if you might call it propagandistic. In other words, if I have some privilege that you don't, the way to look at it is that this is just temporary. It's not because I'm better than you and because I deserve it more. It's, except, well, I mean, in the sense of a reward, like I've worked harder and so on. But in the sense, more ontological sense, it's the reason I have this privilege is that I'm sort of taking care of it and trying to spread it around to the rest of the universe, a little like a patent, you know? So that seems to me to be the best way to understand any kind of leadership, for instance. You know, let's say you're a student and you want to take a course. Well, you're just as good as the professor, but you know, the professor knows things that you don't know, so you go and sit in his class and you learn. And then eventually, and I thought Ian's essay on this subject was quite eloquent, you know, you're sort of trying to make the student as smart as you and give him that knowledge. Now, it's not easy in material things. But I think that if you like, to the extent that GA has an ethic, it's an ethic of egalitarianism. And since I mentioned it, you know, I think that this victimary world that we tend to live in, where everyone tries to be a victim, the danger of that is that you tend to see the fundamental human relationship as that of oppression. And it's always been, you know, the question, the man is born free and everywhere in chains. At least Rousseau said you were born free, but there's a sense that I have that a lot of people, since the demise of socialism, you know, since USSR doesn't work, people feel that now we live in a world where there's a kind of permanent oppression, there's a kind of permanent relationship between stronger and weaker and so on, and this tends to be expressed in racial and ethnic terms and even more gender terms. I think that's very dangerous. I think we should always consider that all humans are basically the same. We're all basically equal. I think if GA has an ethic, it's that. Well, you guys have had enough.
I want to go back to your remark about, and I too was very moved by that piece in Le Monde by Derrida. It's kind of a Vade.
It was in Le Monde, right?
Yeah, it was in Le Monde, as an interview or something.
What was the title? Did it have a title?
What?
Also in Le Monde.
Yeah. About the cultures based on, well, you said faith. We, it's a la foi. You need religious faith and then trust.
Yeah, sure.
And
but it's contiguous. I mean,
oh, sure. You can't separate it. But my question to you was that in this, the world of civic religion, which everybody presumes is a contract, and we agree to the terms of contract, and we stick to them, and if we violate them, then there's a penalty. And I don't think that's true. I really think the social world, the cultural world, is built on trust.
The cultural world, is it?
Well, when its culture is not built on contracts.
Oh.
Society is not built on contracts. That's the given in modern democracies. That is a contract, and we all subscribe to it, so we all are, let's say, obliged to it, and obliged to the rules, and if we don't, you know, we're out. And the what struck me about his essay and your, you know, response to it, L'Oncle Jacques, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Is that, but that's a Frère Jacques, right? But that's a basic anthropological insight that because the society of trust, precisely, is also contiguous with the society of gift,
right?
Even an exchange, etc. The society of contracts. The idea is there is that money neutralizes all relationships. I don't owe you anything. I just paid you, etc.
Yeah, the world of
transactions. There's a theory that that's how we build society. We have you know, contracts which mediate these monetary relations. And
well, whose theory is this? Because even Hobbes doesn't put it that way. I mean, you have the, you know, you give over your power to the Leviathan so he can take care of you.
It's out there in so-called political science.
Rousseau's, certainly that's not Rousseau's idea of a social
No. I'm talking about 20th century. I'm talking about 20th century democracies and civic, you know, consumer societies.
Well, what are you asking me?
I'm asking you yes or no.
Well, you know,
Do you
do
you think the contract model is plausible or the trust model?
You know, this is one of the times when I can say, I'm glad you asked that question. See, I sort of made him answer. You know, Girard always accused me of being a social contract person. Right. I would say, you know, he'd say, you know, the way humans begin is by killing each other. You know, you have the scapegoat and they tear him to pieces. And then afterwards they sort of sit back and say, hey, you know, maybe he brought us peace, so he must be sacred. And you never quite figure out how they say this to each other because they don't have language. You know, so I developed you know, my theory, but he says it's social contract. Why? Because they don't kill each other. No, you know, I can tell you 6,000 times before that they all killed each other because it didn't work out. And finally they get it to work and it's nice and peaceful and say, but, you know, social contract. So I'm sensitive to the question of social contract. Now, you can use the term contract in many ways, but I don't think anybody really believes that society comes, that you have all these sort of independent agents and they get together. You know, that works very nicely for forming a société in the sense of a corporation. But certainly no society is based on contract. And, you know, the greatness of America, and so, well, this is Canada, I shouldn't say. But I mean, you know, the U.S. does have some good points. You know, the greatness of a country like that is that, you know, the people who came together were pretty sophisticated, and they didn't just, you know, make deals. And even then, there were plenty of, you know, negativity, slavery, whatever. But, you know, they came together with a notion of how a society could work, where the central government would be limited in power. I don't need to go into that. But I don't think that anybody has ever really thought of a notion that society is simply a contract that you sort of pay your fee and, you know, you pay your taxes and so on. I mean, there are people who think that way, and maybe you think Republicans think that way, but I think that that's not fair. The Republicans, the difference between Republicans and Democrats, you know, there are two different ways of seeing a central government as essential, but, you know, one of them feels that the sort of Rooseveltian world where, you know, people need to be helped, and the Republicans have more kind of idea of independent small businessman types and so on. There's no point in arguing about that. But the question that you're asking about faith, of course faith is much more fundamental than any kind of contract. But what's beautiful about the market is precisely that you don't need to have faith. If you go to the store and buy something, you can have these transactions, and that allows for a great multiplicity of economic actors and degrees of freedom, which have brought us all this wonderful technology and, you know, wealth that we have accumulated. But that's not the basis of society, and you see in difficult moments, you know, you need to have a much more a much deeper sense of the sacred to hold you together. But you know, the Daily Dial article was about the fact that language itself is based on faith. I think that, you know, faith in the sense of trust, but it's contiguous with religious faith because ultimately societies share certain, you know, core values or whatever. There's such a thing as civic religions, and you know, you have to have some kind of symbolic unity. And maybe even religion. And I think today, one of the problems we're living in today is that, you know, in the West we've tended to neglect our religion, and then all of a sudden you see these Islamists, you know, the most brutal forms of religion. But if you step back from that, you know, these are old-fashioned types of religion. But you have to sort of respect the fact that that really has a cohesive value. And one of the effects on the West may be to sort of rethink, can we simply, you know, get rid of religion? How is it that these people are willing to die for, you know, for Islam? It's, you know, there's something admirable about that, no matter how horrible the deeds can be. And I think, you know, I hate to think that we need more lessons in this before we can straighten out our societies, but at the very least it shows that religion is not dead. We can have a softer and gentler religion. Anyway, that's sort of getting off the top.
Well, I think Eric's had a drink, so let's thank him for...